Hi, welcome to the Political Theory panel number 2 at the New York State Political Science Association 2022. I'm Jeffrey Kurtz from Borough of Manhattan Community College, CUNY. I'm chairing the panel. And we have two panelists today, Claudia Favarato and Guy Aitchison. Our third panelist, Marvin Estrada, was unable to join us, but he submitted a very interesting paper on the concepts of communication and ideology. Claudia and Guy will present their papers, and then I will have some comments on them, and then we'll have some time to discuss. So please.
Can I share my screen? Oh, you have to enable me to share my screen.
I think you can now.
Yeah. Okay. All right, here we go. So I'm Claudia Favarato from the University of Lisbon, where I currently work as a researcher and part-time lecturer. So basically mostly researcher. The paper I present today is not exactly research I did already, but rather some research that I intend to pursue further. So what I aim to do with this presentation is basically it relates to a review of literature and what I have there, and what I decided or I try to identify as future lines of inquiry and relevant patterns that interplay with African political thought and digitalization. And this all starts with a realization that, especially as the pandemic showed us, we are literally living in digital times. The so-called Society 4.0 with 4G technologies and smartphones and so on has become so routine and part of our commonly daily existence that we don't even question it anymore. And we are slowly moving toward the Society 5.0, which means that all these technology that are part of the so-called fourth industrial revolution, for IR, they are changing the way we conduct our existence as individuals, as individuals in the group. And this consider, I'm especially interested in looking at how this interplays with political interactions, constitution of political community. So just a little way of contextualizing how this presentation is done. First of all, I'm going to try to set out what is digitality or the digital sphere that is a part of this broader process of 4IR, the main tenets very loosely defined of African political thought. And then I'm just quickly going to go through the relevance to pursue this research at the time and the items of the research. So when we talk about digitality and digitalization, we refer to one phenomenon that is inscribed with our third industrial revolution. And third industrial revolution relates to all these kind of changes in means of production, as well as social changes that relates to the digital, that relates to artificial intelligence, that relates to technology and science, which is slowly but definitely changing the interaction and the boundaries between the physical, the biological sphere, and the digital. So this tend to be more and more blended, and this also tends to blur the differences between the centrality of a human being, basically the main character of the Anthropocene, moving us to a technocentric future where, for this conjunction of human and machines, humans are no longer the center of what we are talking about. We all have a physical or analog existence, along with a digital human existence that we can call based on avatars, or we can call a different kind of existence, and is mediated through screen devices such as computers, where we are right now, smartphones, and so on. And this makes it so that individuals transposes from the physical or analog sphere to the sphere of digitality. And digitality is part of one of those virtual realities, which are not a new phenomenon for human societies. Virtual realities basically identify all those sort of reality that exceed the physical. A book, for example, it creates a virtual reality where there are characters and there's an old world going in. The difference between previous virtual reality and digitality as a virtual reality relates to the fact that digitality allows for interaction from many to many, is not one author of a book with all the public, but interaction with many to many on asymmetrical horizontal schemes. It really cuts all the significance of space and times because it allows individuals to have this relational many to many relations on asynchronous and atemporal different geographical spheres. And it creates, in fact, it enables in this digital sphere a semi-physical space for social interactions. So it creates a cyber social space where these digital humans or post-humans can conduct their existence and also their own interaction with each other. This idea of how the digitality specifically, it's a sphere that shapes and changes the way we live, interacts closely with African political thought, which is a system of, or which comprises sets of thoughts that tend to put the emphasis on the human element. And not only in ontological terms, that it is more common in Western thought, but mostly it stresses the element of relationality among individuals. So this idea of communocentric or communalistic oriented African thoughts relates to the fact that the epistemological orientation is not merely ontological, but is focused on the relational aspects among individuals as constitutive of the ontology of the individual. And so it poses that emphasis on questions of intersubjectivity, of cooperation, of reciprocity, and of taking part in the community life. So this idea, this central element of African political thought becomes very relevant in the time of digitality, because the digital changes the way that all this relational sphere, how it works. And on the other hand, we have a lack of response and a lack of attention from African political theory into addressing this new phenomena, as well as we have a general tardiness from political theory broadly intended around the globe to keep pace with this new and changing phenomena in the world. So it's like the world is changing so fast and we have some difficulty in keeping pace and going after it and creating theoretical explanations for this very recent and new phenomena. Meanwhile, this new phenomenon as digitalization become more and more part of our life, and we're already immersed in it without having had time to realize what this means. This is especially true in Africa, where the impact of digitalization is growing exponentially. As you can see, between 2005 and 2009, the number of internet users increased by more than 1,000%, which is an amazing number of users. And there was one author that I read, Sir John Lamola, who said that currently the ability to purchase data is basically as relevant as the ability to purchase bread. So individuals really put an emphasis of relevance into the digital existence to the point that it becomes part of one existential needs. So it's really becoming a phenomenon in which people are engulfed with, but not yet aware of what is going on. And while on the other hand, we have plenty of digitalization agenda that have been created by African government or by the African Union, for instance, we don't have an appraisal of what is going on from an Afrocentric perspective. And on the one hand, we have also a huge array of critics that see this process of digitalization as a new form of colonialism that has been dubbed as e-colonialism or digital colonialism, or also algorithm colonialism, or rather as a form of domination, not just from political powers, but mainly from economical powers and the tech giants that operate in the world and around the continent, as a way of controlling digital sovereignty, digital content, and the way that the digital is framed. Finally, the idea of unpacking all the consequences of digitalization in African political thoughts and through these lenses, it helps us to make up some way for the tendency to cherish the past that has been largely shared in African political thought. In other words, what theorists have been doing so far is that this search for a genuine African paradigm has been moving toward looking at the past as basis from which to learn. And upon those cherished past, there has been built a lot of paradigms. And this has been criticized as a very anachronistic view because those traditional quote unquote African societies are not exactly said to be living anymore. And we have been greatly challenged by phenomena of globalization, urbanization, and more recently, digitalization. So a way of unpacking this connection between system of thought and digitalization can be a means toward better understanding African societies today. And now finally, let's start moving to which are the elements for this research agenda, or the many ways through that I think this researcher can move forward. And I started here from the micros, I'm starting from the level of an individual to then move to the macro, where there's more to political paradigm and the community. And when we think about the individual, as I was saying before, we have an analog or physical biological existence that is our in the world existence, along with existence in the digital sphere, which goes end in end to this idea of technogenesis and technocentrality in the future that is becoming, which abandons the human, the anthropos, as element of primary concern, but also it changes what is the nature of the human. This whole interrogation on the nature of being that has been so central in political thought in the past 2000 years in saying who are the beings, it culminates into this idea of transhumanism, of changing nature of the human and even post-humanism. But this closely relates to a so far futuristic and forward-looking sort of approach that is tightly linked to a philosophical process that belongs to the West, not to other culture or system of thoughts. And this absence of question and participation, or at least discussion with our traditional thought, is, in my view, particularly interesting when we look at African political thought and on the centrality of the question of humanness and personhood that exists in the system of thought. Because African political thought, in this sense, is very tightly dependent on a notion of being that it borrows from African philosophy, which distinguishes between biologically human individuals and ethical, normative, metaphysical human persons. So, and on the base of the idea of persons, that is also correlates with the idea of a morally guided individual. Upon it are constructed all the political paradigm and theories that relate to African communitarianism, Ubuntu, and so on and so on. So this centrality, first of all, makes us wonder if there is any kind of compatibility between African political thought idea of a human and of personhood with the digital sphere. And if so, which are they and how they can contribute to the debate that is going on the future of humanity and on post-humanism. And not only related to the ontology of being, as I was saying before, African political thought places a great emphasis on the idea of relationality as constitutive not only of the intersubjective sphere as well as the ontological element of the individual. And this idea of the individual being inherently an intersubjective being, it is well conveyed in those old dictums the Ubuntu I am because you are. But beside this very basic formulation, this has been taken up by a number of academics and scholars in the continent and elsewhere, which try to disentangle this idea of intertwined existence between the individual and the relational ties that constitute his existence. And this happened to be of a very central element constituting the individual as part of a community and the individual oneself. On the other hand, as the individual relies not only in the analog world, but also in the digital world, questions arise on which ethical values are guiding this relational sphere. African intersubjective or relational sphere is said to be guided by clear value, as it is reciprocity, as it is cooperation, and so on, which poses the basis for the idea of a communalist-oriented community, or rather from a group of individuals who works to achieve a common good for the community. But it's unclear whether the digital is simply a means that can foster Western globalized individualistic tendencies, or if we can also work as a mean to foster those values that typically guide African individual. So the question that I see moving forward in this aspect of the research relates first of all on which ethical values and which normative values shape the intersubjective sphere in the digital, and what are the differences or distances from the physical or analog reality. And they also questions if we assume that, for instance, the digital reality is moved solely by individualistic patterns, then what does this tell to us on the communitarian ethos existing nowadays in African societies? Is it being taken over by a digital? Is it changing? And how are these two paradigms interacting? Or is it the opposite? The African traditional ethos is taking over the digital. And this relates also to the way that political communities are framed, and relates to more broadly to the idea of digital versus physical communities. And scholars have generally argued that physical communities, as they lack the physical bonding elements, because there's not necessarily any physical proximity to be shared among the members, they rely more on societal and emotional characters as a way of bonding individual within the community. So this, the incentive in partaking to the community relies to abstract and non-material or physical elements. And this is supposed to foster one's willingness to be part of such community. On the other hand, it is also been posited by more critics, scholars, that digital communities lack clear ethical values that guide how a digital community is structured. So if on the one hand we have a high relevance of the social and psychological element, on the other hand we say yes, but it is a situation of chaos. So we don't know who is guiding what and if there is any end whatsoever. And this is an element that takes much of the value of the digital community. And so I see that there are several elements into this that requires more attention and broader research, among which are the normative elements and the normative values guiding the political community, this distance between the individualistic and the communitarian orientation, the idea of taking part in the community and the possibility of having a political community that is digitally spread in time and space, so that we have a digital community where everybody take part in some sort of acts that are needed to perform to partake in the community while being in Nigeria, South Africa, and UK at the same time, through new means and new modes of interaction. It also relates very closely to the idea of a moral person, of this fact of achieving ethical maturity to become a person. That is one of the requirements to partake in the political community according to, again, quote unquote, traditional African political thought, to what has been stressed and an inherent element to become a person. And it questions whether the digital sphere can be a mean to promote those sort of ethical values for the maturation of one individual into a person. And moreover, it is to wonder if the digital sphere is a means that it recreates simply patterns of asymmetries and exclusion as in the physical world, or whether it creates completely new ones. We already know that there are several issues for which individuals may be excluded from the digital community, among others, accessibility to the internet, availability of technology, being educated, being able to read and write, or language, among others, or simply having technical skills and knowing how to operate with this kind of devices. And this is a new divide that creates different patterns of exclusion and inclusion. On the other hand, it also relates on a more philosophical level on the notion of personhood that excludes from partaking in political life all those individuals who do not have capabilities to reciprocate. For example, the traditional paradigm of African political thought tend to exclude homosexuals or queer because they don't reciprocate in the community with the capability to provide offspring or to have children. And this is one reason not to meet the duties that the community put upon the individual. But as the digital community relates to the idea of post-humans possibly having offspring, might choose to be one of its requirements for the community, and hence it would enable also all those individuals who don't refer to themselves as essentially gender into a gender binary distinction, or who are homosexuals, or people who simply do not intend to engage in any kind of reproduction activity, as being fully members of the community. So it creates and gives us the opportunity to have new patterns of membership and growing of personhood. And as I was trying to put together a little bit of these elements into a more defined political paradigm for African today that takes a distance from the traditional idea of a analog bonded African political thought into what I like to call digital African communitarianism. And this would be a kind of analysis that starts with the roots of African political thought we need today, but that reapprises several central concepts in the light of digitality. And I think that the core concepts that need to be reprised are, first of all, the idea of freedom, participation, representation, and the idea of revised democracy as participatory and political practice. The idea of freedom has long been a central issue in African political thought, especially in relation to the standing of individual and community, and on the overbearing place of the community in individual existence. And as such, the community has been said to trample on individual liberties. On the other hand, the digital can provide a space and a means for individuals to express oneself more easily without having such of a stance of a community above oneself. Or the digital can also be a sphere to exercise further authoritarian and the dictator power, for example, through the use of technology bans or internet shutdowns. So it offers here a two pathways that needs to be further explored in its entrances and on its possibilities. But it also promotes at the same time new kinds of participation, as I said before, with constraints as a matter of availability of resources, language, etc. But it creates the possibility to bridge gaps, for example, as between the rural and the urban, and among people, and to enable new ways of participating in social, civic, and political life. For movement, political parties, political engagement can follow different and new paths, different and that differ from the ones that we would use in the analog sphere. And this might be a path toward realizing or toward fulfilling in some way those paradigm that in African political thought relates strongly to the idea of participatory and or consensual democracy, because we can provide a mean not to take part in the political affairs without a representative democracy, but through a direct engagement. And they might promote new means of participation, as for example, it is decisions making by consensus. So there are several potentials that have not yet been explored, and all this need to be fully calibrated into thinking about African communitarianism today and paradigms that are inscribed within this theory. And just to sum it up, the main takeaways from this research, the focus starts mainly from the idea of a post-human on the ontological and the relational sphere. It looks at the way the intersubjective sphere is constituted, the normative and ethical values and underpinning of a political community, to finally look at the elements of a political paradigm. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Guy.
Thank you. I don't have any presentation slides.
That's fine.
So I'm just gonna kind of ad lib on the paper. So Yeah, I reread the paper. So this paper is, the first thing to say is I have a co-author on this paper, which is Dr. Ryan Essex. And he's an Australian researcher who does work on medical ethics, and he's had experience working in immigration detention centres. So I come at it from more the realm of political theory and philosophy, normative political theory, and he comes at it from a psychotherapeutic background, working with people in onshore detention centres in Australia, which has some of the most draconian immigration detention centres. And he and I have been looking at this issue about self-harm in immigration detention. So what we're trying to do in the paper is reflect on the ways in which people in immigration detention resist their captivity. Now, there's been quite a lot of reporting about suicides, self-immolation, hunger strikes, various other forms of self-harm in immigration detention, particularly in Australia. And there's different ways in which people normally approach this issue. So the authorities in Australia and elsewhere have been inclined to dismiss it as purely a kind of private mental health issue. They say that this is not really a protest, it's more of a personal trauma that someone's undergoing that, you know, we should think of in terms of providing them with the appropriate medical and psychological treatment, but it's not political. Alternatively, they take a completely opposite view and say this is a kind of attempt at political manipulation. People are starving themselves, people are harming themselves in order to gain some kind of illicit advantage over decision makers and immigration authorities. So that's kind of one reading that the authorities have. Generally, people who are advocates for migrant detainees have been inclined to disregard a purely political reading of the activity. They generally want to present it as a form of trauma, as a kind of mental illness, a mental health issue that is itself the product of detention. So self-harm is a kind of tragic effect of punitive immigration detention conditions. So that's one of the kind of readings that advocates typically have. And it makes sense because obviously it's important to ascribe responsibility for this tragic situation and the violence and harms that result from detention at the door of political decision makers who impose these conditions on people, these kind of barbaric conditions upon people. But the problem with this view is it kind of often erases the political agency of people in detention and the way in which they're actually trying to resist their detention and reclaim some degree of autonomy against their captors. So we started to try and conceptualize immigration, detainee self-harm and suicide as a form of political resistance. And obviously it's quite a fraught area to discuss, and it's obviously, you know, quite a difficult area to discuss, and one should be careful about trying to kind of normalize this activity or read into it a certain political and ideological perspective that people don't necessarily hold. So that's just a kind of caveat at the beginning. So one of the things we have been doing is speaking to people who've been in Australian immigration detention, speaking to a number of people. By this point, we've spoken to about, I think only about 4 or 5 people, but it was incredibly informative because these people spent time in Papua New Guinea in an Australian immigration detention. They talked to us about hunger strikes. They talked to us about cases of self-harm, and they, along with other detainees who've spoken out about this issue, have tried to talk about it as a form of resistance. So what we try and do in the paper is offer a way of thinking about what exactly that means and some of the ethical implications of thinking about self-harm as a form of resistance. So this is, like I say, a first draft. When I reread it just now in preparation for giving this talk, I realized it's much too long and it needs to be cut down. And I think it's probably a bit repetitive in places, and it's a bit overwritten. It could probably be tightened up immensely. So if anyone has any ideas about how it can be kind of made a bit sharper and not recycling the same points, I guess that's just a kind of where you get with a first draft. But I guess trying to focus what the overall takeaway headline point is and trying to tighten it up is kind of where I'm at before we send it somewhere. Just to give you some background upon this issue, I mean, there's an immense, no, not an immense, I beg your pardon, there's some empirical research done on mental health and self-harm and suicide in detention. A lot of it has been done in Australia, mainly because they have such a bad detention system. One, by the way, that the UK is thinking of adopting, in fact, making it worse by sending people to Rwanda. I can't believe I'm saying this, but asylum seekers would get sent to Rwanda offshore. They would have to stay there, even if they succeed in their claim. So obviously highly illegal and immoral, but I won't get into that. But Australia gives us a example of where this type of policy might be heading. And there's some research that shows that rates of self-harm in Nauru, one of the offshore detention centres, were over 200 times that of detention onshore, and of rates of self-harm among the general population. I beg your pardon, yeah, rates of self-harm among the general population. The rates of self-harm and suicide are higher than in prison. People often leave immigration detention with much worse mental health than they went in with, but people tend to sometimes, I don't say tends to, sometimes people leave prison with slightly better mental health, but that never really happens in the case of immigration detention. That's not an argument for prison, by the way, it's just an observation about some of the differences between them. And often this kind of self-harm is related to the uncertainty, the anxiety of not knowing about their case. It's related to having their cases refused, to the conditions of their detention. And after a few months, it's quite predictable that people in these detention conditions often do go on to have mental health problems. And some research has been done internationally about this, but a lot of this research is in medical journals or sociological journals, and it takes a more medicalized reading of this phenomena. So what we're trying to do is think about it in terms of ethics and politics. And like I say, we're trying to do justice to the self-understanding of many detainees and the way in which they see themselves as kind of defying the powers that be in detention. So, like I say, some of the self-harm that we've seen takes the form of suicide attempts, jumping from extreme heights, jumping onto barbed wire, cutting themselves, eating poison, starving themselves. Sometimes they're explicitly done as a form of protest with like demands and banners and chanting, and they're done collectively, but oftentimes they're not. Oftentimes they're done individually. Now, so one of the difficulties, of course, of trying to conceptualize this as a form of resistance is it doesn't really fit into what we typically think of as resistance. So when we tend to think of political resistance, we tend to, I've given some indication in the paper, we tend to think of it as kind of being public, being performed in the public sphere to attract attention. It's often collective and being performed as part of a political movement. It's often aimed at political change. So it's trying to articulate demands and gain concessions. So rallies, marches, strikes, boycotts, riots, civil disobedience, they seem to fit the bill. But self-harm looks more like what some theorists have talked about in terms of infrapolitics. James Scott has given that term, one term you may be familiar with. It's kind of below the radar politics, forms of everyday defiance. And I think there is some good reason for thinking about resistances in a kind of broader sense. I mean, some of the obstacles that detainees face, like other oppressed groups, to engaging in more familiar forms of resistance are the following. I mean, it's very difficult for them to organise politically in the detention centre. There's different languages, different nationalities, cultures. They don't have access to communications and the media often. They may not know how to formulate political demands in the context they're in, although they often have a sense of themselves as being unfairly victimised. And a lot of their complaint centres around the denial of autonomy, the way in which if we think about it, obviously you're in detention, you're basically in prison-like conditions. Your autonomy is taken away from you. You're subject to massive amounts of surveillance and control, and you feel like you're being objectivized and dehumanized. And some of them have talked about forms of self-harm as being a way to reclaim some energy, reclaiming sovereignty over themselves and their bodies, showing themselves they're still alive and that they can defy the system, which is built upon the kind of orderly reproduction of a passive and compliant and also healthy population of detainees. We draw in the paper on some kind of philosophical resources for conceptualizing resistance. And in particular, there's a paper from Daniel Silverman, who thinks of resistance as a response to someone or something that involves either opposing or counteracting or withstanding. So it's quite a broad view of resistance, but it's congenial to our purposes because it allows for the fact that resistance may not always be aimed at kind of overt political change. It may instead be aimed at defiance, counteracting some of the effects of oppression. And it often takes unusual and unexpected forms. And I would say that none more so than the case of self-harm, because one way of looking at self-harm is you're not resisting oppression, you're actually amplifying oppression. You're actually making it worse for yourself. You're creating pain, suffering, and potentially permanent damage to yourself in the condition of oppression. So that is true. That's part of the paradox as we see it, that in a certain sense, it is an effect of oppression. It is an outcome of oppression. It is an amplification of oppression, that there's self-harm. But it also has this side that it's a way of people trying to resist their oppression. And sometimes it has this kind of communicative role. It's a way of saying, what's being done to me is this bad. This is how terrible what's being done to me is. This is the kind of suffering that I'm enduring on an emotional and psychological level. And this is what it represents in physical form. I can show that to you. Sometimes it's a way of communicating with the guards, with people in the media. Sometimes lawyers and psychiatrists are able to publicize the action beyond the prison walls, but sometimes it's just done in private, in their own cells, in toilet cubicles and so on. And here it looks more like an attempt to kind of reclaim a kind of suppressed form of agency. In all cases, it often involves a form of disruption to the system. It involves guards being called, medical personnel being involved. It may involve people being removed from the detention centre. So it involves a certain amount of disruption to the system, which may be a kind of form of disruptive power that people in detention are exercising. But yeah, it has this different dimension there. So it has this communicative dimension, it has this expressive dimension as a way, just the difference in terms of communication. I take communication to be more about trying to influence others and change things. It has a kind of more instrumental side to it, whereas expression it can just be like a cry of rage, a cry of pain, a cry of despair, or a way of asserting one's kind of agency, even if it doesn't expect any particular outcome from it. So in terms of the paper, we draw on kind of psychoanalytic literature on the nature of self-harm, the way it can be a form of communication and self-expression. And there's parallels here with kind of some of the sacrificial forms of protest that people in the civil rights movement have been involved in. So again, we draw on Michael Biggs's idea of communicative suffering here. So civil rights protesters often put themselves in situations where they face violence from the police, and they're trying to call attention to the violence of the system. They're trying to communicate their determination to resist it, and they're also trying to underscore the violence of the system that's oppressing them. So there are certain affinities with other forms of resistance, even if it doesn't fit the classic model of resistance. It's also coercive of the authorities, because it's a way of trying to, well, if you think about it, in liberal democratic jurisdictions, the authorities are going to have institutional duty of care to people in their control. Even though conditions are terrible in detention centres, there's still a kind of obligation of care, which is an illegal obligation. And by kind of implicating the authorities in this process of harm and self-violence against their will, they are exercising a kind of form of moral coercion against the authorities. They're exposing them to bad publicity, to shame, and also to the disruptive effects of the action. So they're underlining the hypocrisy of kind of liberal jurisdictions and giving a concrete sense to the idea that there is a structural form of violence that detainees suffer from. So yeah, in the final part of the paper, we discuss some differences between a medical reading and a political reading. I think that part needs to be thin. Well, again, it needs to be cut down a bit, but it needs a bit more nuance, I think, in terms of thinking about the medical professionals' obligations. There's an obligation maybe to kind of draw attention to what's happening, but one doesn't want to encourage this type of behavior as well, because one wouldn't want to kind of say, well, this is the right way to get your voice across, and this is the right way to be heard, and to try and, so there's a delicate balancing line between actually exposing that this is what's going on in these detention centres, and also not actually kind of normalising it or kind of encouraging it inadvertently. So that's something that we need to sort of think about. And yeah, so I think maybe I'll leave it there for now. But yeah, I look forward to any comments that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for the papers. The presentations, I thought, outlined and in some ways amplified the papers very nicely. Both papers had in common, among their strengths, that they're attempting, and I think succeeding at a kind of empirically oriented political theory, right? Both of you in different ways are asking theoretically informed questions or theory informing questions about ongoing events, about things that are happening as we speak. And so they make a very interesting pair that way. And they're also both concerned with, as is almost, maybe not inevitable, but as is often the case with political theory inquiries in our time, at least, they're both concerned with questions of individuality or personhood and community or belonging. So I'll talk a little bit about Claudia's paper and then about Guy's, and then we'll open up to whatever response or discussion the two of you are interested in. So Claudia's paper, Digitality in African Political Thought, Mapping a Research Agenda, lays out, I think, a very fascinating and promising direction for research. The idea of the coming together of this phenomenon of digitization or digitality with the predominantly communitarian political thought and political culture of sub-Saharan African societies. This is a great topic, partly because much of the digitization or digitalization that's happened in the past 15, 20 years has been in societies like North America and Western Europe, Northern Pacific Rim as well, societies that are already to some extent individualistic, especially if we're thinking of North America and Western Europe. And so it's a fascinating question. What happens when this phenomenon that we associate with individualistic culture and politics occurs also within a much more communitarian context? And Claudia outlines, I think I would count it as three possible general directions that the change might take. And of course, these might all happen at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. One is that African politics and political thought becomes more individualistic in response to the pressures of digitality. Second, that there's a different arrangement of power within African politics because of digitalization. Sometimes you use terms like e-colonialism or algorithmic colonialism, and you mentioned some other possible reconfigurations of power. And third, the possibility that digitality is put to some more communitarian uses than digitized North Americans and West Europeans have made of it so far. All of these are plausible. And as I said, they may all, as I think you say in the paper, may all happen at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, but they're distinct possibilities. In outlining your research questions about personhood, individuality and community, power, and the possibility of a digital Afro-communitarianism, it seems to me that you're suggesting a three-way tension here in terms of how you think about what digitality is and what it does. And at times, I wished you had made this a little more explicit. I think I'm not reading anything into your paper. I think this is there. But there are times when you talk about digitality as a kind of freedom, for example, using phrases like tearing down constraints. The digitization tears down constraints. There are also times then, in contrast with that, when you suggest that digitalization or the experience of digitality is a structuring force. I guess force is the right word, that it's a set of rules and roles. For example, when you use the phrase cyber social space, that suggests an analogy with physical spaces, right? Topological or geographic spaces, which always structure the relations that happen within them. So digitality is a form of freedom. Digitality is a form of structure. These can both be true at the same time, but I think the tension between those two is important. And then third, I would see this as a distinct from both of those. You talk about digitality as a medium for relationships. And it's interesting, you don't emphasize, if my memory is correct, you may not even use, you certainly don't emphasize the words media, mediation, medium, that family of terms. And often when we talk about things that happen in the digital world, we use words like those, right? For instance, in the phrase social media. And I think throughout your paper, there's an implicit concern with the fact that political and social relationships are always mediated somehow by something. And it might be interesting if you would draw that out a little more explicitly. So again, some things, adding to that, some things that I think are implied by your research outline, but I think it might be interesting if you drew out more explicitly. First of all, four things here. You make clear, in some parts of the paper, you make this a matter of whether or not a set of political and social relations or political and social ideas is communitarian versus not communitarian. But there are also times in the paper when you suggest that that's not the only relevant distinction, that we also might distinguish between different varieties of communitarian thought or communitarian relations. So I guess we could say community on the basis of what? Connections among people, and thereby also exclusions of people, of what kinds or on what basis. So one way to ask the question about digitality in the context of communitarian political thought and culture is to ask not just whether digitality fits with communitarianism, but what kinds of communitarianism or community are fostered or excluded, amplified or muted by the trend toward digitization. Similarly then, I'm not sure if this is a second point or just a different angle in that first point. That an emphasis, you suggest a concern with the structuring, rules and roles aspect of digital life, but I think it would be interesting to bring that out a bit more emphatically as a balance to the concern with freedom. I'm really interested in the question, which again, you raise at various points in the paper, but don't necessarily emphasize, that the shift toward digitalization means that something is gained and something is lost, that there are new forms of relationality, possibly new experiences of personhood, new avenues for communication or expression. And I agree with Guy on the useful distinction there. And those always displace other forms of community, other forms of connection, other forms of expression or communication. So I wonder what would happen. I wonder what you might uncover in the course of your research if you systematically traced that double question: what's gained and what's lost in the shift toward digitalization? What's enabled and what's displaced? And I'm thinking here in particular about the part of your paper where you talk about power, and where you talk about the forms of political action or political connection that are enabled or made possible by digitality. And I'm thinking, I mean, as someone in the United States here, I'm thinking about recent events in my own country, and I'm thinking, for example, about the role of digital politics in making possible something like the January 6, 2021 assault on the United States Capitol, and the speculation that many people have offered, many observers have offered, that digital political relationships may be conducive to certain forms of violent and extremist politics in a different way than in-person political relationships tend to be. Not that, yeah, in a different way. And so I wonder, in a larger sense, not just in North American or West European, but also in African digitalized contexts, are there going to be not only new forms of connection in ways that we would see as positive, but new forms of propensity for violence, new forms of kind of a dehumanized political connection that come with digitality? So when I talk about things being gained and things being lost, that's some of what I have in mind. So then two last questions, mostly out of curiosity. I think this is a fascinating research agenda, and really my comments are just simply about hoping that you'll be able to amplify some things that you've already suggested. But two questions out of curiosity. First of all, will there be any part of your project, this may be outside of the scope of what you're looking at, but I'm curious whether it will be possible to include with your project, or helpful to include within your project, some attention to the, for lack of a better term, the analog background of the digital world. So I have the impression, and I may be incorrect about this, but I have the impression that some of the sub-Saharan African countries are places where some of the extractive mining that makes screen devices possible happens, and where some of the waste disposal of digital devices from wealthy countries, and I assume from African countries as well, happens. And I'm curious about the distinctive role that some of the sub-Saharan countries have been put into with regard to making computer devices possible. That may or may not, as I said, be relevant to your project, but I'm curious whether it is. And second, in terms of just a question, I'm curious about hearing more about what exactly you're going to be looking at in this project. To what extent will you be looking at formal political thought by scholars or academics, or to what extent will you be looking at the political aspects of common culture or popular culture, or something else entirely that I may not have thought to put on that list? I'm curious about your answer to that question. Guy's paper then, self-harm in immigrant detention, political, not just medical. So my sense is that the paper does three really significant things. First of all, it reports on the phenomenon of self-harm among immigrant detainees. And this is something I have to admit that I did not know much about. I think I've read some news articles that make reference to this, but your reporting of the facts was moving, to say the least, and certainly informative. Second, you outline two conflicting paradigms for talking about and understanding this phenomenon of self-harm among detainees. First of all, the idea that this is manipulative. Second, the idea that it's primarily to be understood as a mental health phenomenon. And then third, you propose an alternative paradigm, a third paradigm. You argue that both of those paradigms are inadequate and that we should have a third paradigm, a political paradigm for understanding self-harm among immigrant detainees. So my first question is, if you're right that we should have this political paradigm, if you're right about that, what is the consequence? I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure. What I think you're suggesting is that if readers should find your argument persuasive, that what you would have achieved would be to offer a new vocabulary for immigrant advocates. Instead of saying people are harming themselves, because this is a mental health problem to be addressed through mental health avenues, advocates for immigrants would be able to say this is a legitimate form of protest and should be responded to as a legitimate form of protest. I think that's what you're saying, but if I've misunderstood, I would be interested to know, how I've misunderstood your aim. And then the secondary aim seems to be that you're offering a challenge to political theorists, whether academic political theorists or just people who think about politics, broadly defined. The challenge being, do we know how to recognize politics when we see it? Do we know how to recognize political action when we see it? So that's a question that I'm hoping you'll be able to address. In terms of the argument of your paper, you convinced me that the two paradigms you describe are both inadequate. You argue, I think, effectively that the phenomenon of self-harm should not be seen simply as an illicit or manipulative form of action. You agree, it's interesting, you agree partly with the people who make the charge that this is a manipulative action, in the sense that you recognize it as a form of disruptive power. The difference is that you regard it as legitimate rather than illegitimate. You argue, I think, very persuasively that some form of protest against or resistance to the conditions of these immigration detention facilities is entirely appropriate. And you argue, I think, again, persuasively, that there's no other obvious form of protest available to detainees. Second, then, again, I think you argue very persuasively that this is not simply a medical or mental health issue. And the key point here in your argument, as I understand it, is that it's purposeful action. It's deliberate or purposeful. I'm not sure if I should say purposeful or purposive, but either way, it's action with purpose. You use the term resistance, which I think fits pretty well. I would encourage you, by the way, you cite several people who define the term resistance, but I would encourage you to keep in mind that the term has a long history and was used, its origins, as I understand, seem to be in medieval, the pre-revolutionary political vocabularies. Before the modern idea of revolution, there was the idea of resistance. You also assert that it's not just medical because self-harm can be an assertion of autonomy. That's an idea I want to come back to, but it seems to be very important in your paper. And you also suggest, to me, this third point feels separate from the autonomy, although you might disagree with me on this, that this phenomenon of self-harm is an assertion of something else. You use the phrase to feel human again. I believe that was a quotation from somebody, or to feel real. And I wonder if part of what you're describing here might better be described as a demand for recognition, which is not the same as an assertion of autonomy. So I'm convinced that neither of those two paradigms is sufficient. I'm not entirely convinced yet that the word political is the right name for the understanding we should have, that we should think of this as political. There's a risk here in your paper that you turn political into a kind of residual category. It's not illegitimate, It's not merely medical, therefore it's something else. And political, if you're going to convince me that it's political, then you have to convince me that politics is something more than a residual category here. So for first question along those lines, I want to know whether you think of all forms of resistance and protest as being political, whether we should equate political with, or whether we should include all forms of resistance and protest as political. You mentioned large-scale hunger strikes, and you point out that they fit a standard definition of politics as being public and collective and aimed at resisting or changing policies. That makes sense. A large-scale hunger strike is clearly political according to a familiar definition. Individual forms of self-harm are different from that, partly because they're active rather than passive self-harm, right? Not eating, I would think of as a kind of passive self-harm. I'm not doing something to myself, but cutting myself or taking poison is an active form. That's an interesting difference.
Yeah.
But they're also, as you point out, individual and not necessarily public. So I want to know what definition of politics we would have to have in order to claim these individual, not necessarily public acts of self-harm as politics. And I want to know what would be the consequences for how we think about other forms of action or in other contexts if we were to adopt that definition of politics. What would be clarified about political life in general if we adopted the definition of politics that you seem to be relying on without stating? What would be obscured? And I have to say, my worry is that if we claim these forms of action as being political, the self-harm, that we actually lose the option of, we lose a powerful and important way of critiquing or criticizing the conditions under which immigrant detainees are held. We lose the ability to say they are being deprived of political membership. They are being deprived of the possibility of politics. And so the term you borrow from James Scott, infra-political, is interesting here. A similar term that I've heard other writers use would be pre-political. There are times in the paper where you seem to suggest kind of a spectrum, right? At one end of the spectrum, we have forms of action that are clearly political. And at the other end, forms of action that are not political per se, but that are somehow on a continuum with political things, if that makes sense, right? You seem to suggest a continuum with no clear border, no clear dividing line between infra-political or pre-political and political. That might be a helpful way to put it. I'm not sure. But I have to admit, I'm kind of inclined to say, I want to reserve the option of saying part of what's wrong with immigration detention facilities is that people are deprived of politics. And that self-harm is a form of action that people take in the absence of politics. That would be another way to describe this, which is not the way you've chosen. So I'm interested in why you choose this route. A last point then, and this is, I'm thinking here partly about the communitarian emphasis of Claudia's paper. At times you suggest that the assertion of autonomy is enough to characterize or qualify an action as political. And I want to push back against the idea that autonomy is by itself a defining feature of the political. Some idea of membership or recognition, I would suggest is important as well. And you hint at that. You suggest something of the sort, but again, it might disrupt your argument in a helpful way if you were to draw that out specifically. I will stop there because I want to leave some time for both of you to talk. But again, both of these were very interesting and promising papers. I really appreciated getting the chance to read both of them. So what we do in our remaining time, we've got maybe 20, 30 minutes. You can respond to what I said. You can ask each other questions. You can do what you want.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeff. Do you want to go first, Claudia?
As you wish. I went first before, so now you go. Finish it.
Okay. I was hoping to get a bit more time to think about my reply. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for those really helpful, really careful comments that you've provided, Jeff. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I've taken quite a lot of notes. So, yeah, the first main question I think you asked was, if we're right about it being political, what are the consequences that flow from that understanding? So I think partly it's that we kind of would avoid having an overly paternalistic view of people in immigration detention purely as sort of victims of their circumstance. It restores to them a certain amount of agency, and kind of hopefully avoid some of the implications that, you know, these people are mentally unwell, they just need other people to advocate on their behalf, and it's a rather top-down process. So it might have that helpful implication. It might mean that we start to think about this in terms of, you know, recognize it as a kind of injustice, according to the claims of people who are in detention. So that means that people who are involved in the medical profession can start to think not merely in terms of how do we treat these people, but how do we address the structures? How do we fulfill our role as health professionals in a broader sense, in the sense of kind of, you know, the structural determinants of health that sometimes get talked about, the issues of injustice and reform that are essential to health. And a lot of medical codes of ethics do include within them nowadays issues around injustice and structures, because those are so fundamental to health in general. So perhaps it can orient our understanding of this phenomenon that way. And, you know, then to kind of think about their role sort of politically, we can think about our own obligations to people in detention as being, you know, obligations of sort of maybe political solidarity, given the kind of resistance they're mounting. So it kind of helps us to see it in those terms. Yeah, the term resistance as well, it's interesting what you said about it being a pre-modern term. I actually read a tweet the other day, which I hadn't thought, it was a tweet, I can't remember who it was by, but they said that the benefits of the term reform and revolution is that they're kind of purposeful, and they at least acknowledge standards by which they can be judged. So we can tell whether or not reform or revolution is successful. It's kind of oriented to change. And that's a kind of more modern idea. And then they had a problem with this idea of resistance, because they were saying, well, resistance is kind of an overly broad term that doesn't seem to have any standards by which it can be judged successful or not. You know, I can be resisting by, you know, just opposing something without any kind of follow through. So they were raising some problems with the idea of resistance. But I think there are still virtues of keeping this language of resistance, because I just think it's generally true that people do behave in certain ways where they resist the authority against them, and they don't have to be engaged in kind of political action. There's a slightly elitist danger when we kind of reserve politics for a certain style of empowered politics, I guess, that is only accessible to certain people. So I think the term resistance does have benefits itself. Yeah, the point about autonomy, I guess partly what they're doing is they're not just reclaiming their autonomy. I think partly what they're doing is they're showing they're human beings. You know, there's a kind of tradition of thinking about human beings that's based around thinking in terms of our common human vulnerabilities to pain and suffering. I mean, if you look at Christianity, it's based around suffering. Buddhism's based around suffering. The great religions, Shakespeare talks about, you know, in Merchant of Venice, he says, if you prick me, do I not bleed? And all this kind of stuff that from in the face of anti-Semitism. So, you know, there's a kind of element of that reasserting their humanity as people who are yeah, who can suffer and are mortal. I guess that's part of it. Maybe I should draw out of that a bit more and think about how it relates to autonomy. And I definitely think, yeah, your point about whether autonomy is a sufficient condition for it being political, because then that might end up being overly inclusive, and that might create difficulties elsewhere if we want to say, oh, this is politics and resistance, when just because someone's trying to reclaim a bit of autonomy. So yes, that's one thing that's worthwhile thinking about. Yeah, I also liked your point about, yeah, that's a good point. I like that point about one of the reasons we want to criticize immigration detention is because it denies people access to politics. It kind of leaves them without politics. And then maybe what I'm doing is saying, well, actually, no, they can still self-harm. They still have politics, and that's not something you'd want to do. I mean, so I guess, yeah, that's something maybe to think through. My initial reaction is that I think we can still mount that critique. We can still say they've been driven to this kind of extreme form of politics. They've been just driven to this kind of politics that no one should have to engage in, which is self-harm, while still maintaining the force of the critique, I think. But maybe that needs to be spelled out a bit better. Yeah, there's much more other stuff that you said, but I'll leave it there for now so we can hear from Claudia.
Thank you. Can I start with just a quick comment on Guy's research? Because what you were saying about self-harm as a form of political protest, it made me remember a lot of naked power or naked protest as a form of political protest, which is just using one's body and nudity as a form to show protest. And I wonder if there is anything from this literature that you could draw inspiration also for the analysis that you are doing. Because I can see a lot of common points between those two, even if in the second case, of course, it removed the prejudicial part of it. But I think on theoretical level, you can find a lot of common points.
Yeah. Do you have any particular examples of naked protests in mind?
Well, I can send you a podcast that was relating to this. I think maybe this can be a good base for you where to start.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
And then from there you can go through literature and anything else.
Yeah.
All right. And well, thank you, Geoff, or Geoff, now I'm not sure, Geoff, for all your commentaries. It was very, very insightful. It's very, how you do structure your paper in your mind in one way, and then you see somebody else reading it, and it's very interesting to see the way that other people read and can restructure and analyze your paper. And also, I found very interesting this controversy that you put out between the analog or the physical as a place of extraction of material that we need to build these devices, and how these devices are changing our existence. And somehow this slipped out of my mind. It's one of those points in which I hadn't focused as much. But now that you mention it, seems like you just said something that I should have focused also from the very beginning. And it is indeed a very interesting topic in which to deal with. And yeah, it was a new avenue to go down with. And thank you very much for this insight. And I know that throughout the paper and the research that I intend to pursue, I refers a lot to the relations among individual, relations as basis for political groups, relations as basis for social groups. And I sort of tried to avoid mention the idea of medium and communication specifically, to focus more on the idea of relation as related to this onto-relationality of being, not to focus just the idea of medium or words or always relates more strictly to the idea of just media. But I want to maintain the focus on more of an existential shift rather than just a communication shift, to make it more of a point the change that is happening is not simply in the way we communicate to each other, is not using shortcuts or acronyms in the way we speak, but it really refers to something more deep into human existence, into an in this case, onto-relational change of human beings. And this also is shaping the way that I intend to pursue this research, because of course there is a growing body of literature that deals with the idea of post-humanism and the effects of the 4AI and digitalization in Africa and elsewhere. But I think it's always a good basis from which to start, and I'm trying to build as much connection as possible with people and scholars working with it in the continent. But I'm really interested to look at how people are perceiving this change, or how it's changing in daily life and generally a way of conducting political life. So what I'm thinking to do is actually to spend some time in Nigeria and Mozambique to conduct some field work, especially with politicians who operate at the local and the national level. I'm at a point in which I'm trying to define who to contact and where to go more specifically, and trying to understand how they deal with the digital. Do they behave the same way they would behave in a face-to-face encounter? How people respond to it, or how does this shape the behavior of politicians? How the digital political community reacts, participate, and so on. And I picked those two countries because Nigeria is currently one of the most digitalized country in the sub-Saharan Africa. I think it has a numbers of internet users that exceeds and almost double the amount of population of Nigeria, because people tend to have several devices to connect to the internet. So it shows quite an advanced pace and quite an advanced stage of digitalization that surely has had already some profound impact on the way that digitality affects political idea. In Mozambique, because it is growing at a similar pace, but still on an absolute level of users is still much below the level of Nigeria. So the idea is try to show, going into this very advanced and middle stage process of digitalization, and possibly from the comparison of the two, drawing more insights that can relate not only to the two countries, but for African political thought into those different varieties of African communitarianism in the continent.
Thank you both for the responses. Yet, Guy, did you want to add more?
Yeah, so yeah, I just had some general sort of thoughts on reading the paper, Claudia, and they're not as detailed as Jeff's commentary, which was again really helpful. But again, I thought it was a great topic, and I think you've identified some really interesting lines of connection. I just thought it was really interesting, especially because it's something I hadn't really come across much, African political thought. So yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, one of the things there's just a sort of few really general things that struck me in reading it, is that I found sometimes, again, this is coming from someone who doesn't know much about African political thought, but I thought I would have liked to have seen a bit more kind of breakdown of what African political thought is, because it's quite a broad term, African political thought. So I was wondering to myself, is there different countries with different traditions? Like, is kind of North African political thought different to Southern African political thought? And just sort of trying and some of the nuances. And I thought one of the things it would be interesting to know that didn't fully come across in the papers, like, what are the sources for knowing what African political thought is? So there's there's references in the paper, but I was wondering, like, are there any kind of key authors who are sort of taken as emblematic of African political thought? Like, are there certain texts, certain traditions, certain oral traditions? Like, where do we get this idea of African political thought from? And so I thought some of the characterizations of African political thought as being sort of communitarian, to do with relationality and intersubjectivity. Again, I would like to see maybe a bit about like where that comes from, and sort of like what does that mean in practice? A bit more about how do we understand these concepts of communitarianism. Intersubjectivity is another one, which again, it strikes me as slightly, it could mean a lot of different things into subjectivity. So to sort of characterize African political thought as intersubjective, I would like to again maybe hear a bit more about what that means, where that comes from, relationality as well. So yeah, I guess it's for someone who's coming from a position not being very well informed about African political thought, trying to know the sources of it, some of the nuances amongst African political thought, and a bit of a kind of unpacking of the core concepts around African political thought would have kind of helped me get a firm grip on kind of how this research agenda is going to unfold, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, your comment actually made me realize how much African political thought keeps being kind of a, not exactly a niche, but sort of a bubble in itself. Because whenever you talk about African political thought with people who are into African philosophy or African studies and so on, people tend to have a clear idea of who you're talking about, who are the authors, what are the ideas, what these concepts refer to. But as soon as you open it to a broader audience, let's say political theorists in general, people suddenly like, okay, but this is not really ever on the table. So please put it out and put it forward. What are you talking about? Because this sounds like something of your club, but let's bring the club together and let's talking about it much more. And I guess that's exactly what I did in the paper. I took it for granted that people who will be interested in reading it and understand it would be people who are already acquainted with most of the concepts that I did put forward, and hence my lack of unpacking of all these concepts that were there.
But can you answer the part about where the sources for African political thought are? Like, as in how do we know? Like, are there kind of canonical texts or traditions or?
Yeah, as a matter of African political thought, we have a tendency that comes more from ideologists and academic politicians. There were those that came mainly after the independence, as is the case of Kwame Nkrumah or Julius Nyerere, as is the case. They have a huge set of corpus and text in which they explicitly put down their political ideas and they try to put it in place in the countries. And then this started to change throughout the 90s, with the appearance of professional philosophers, so-called professional philosophers. There are all those philosophers that started to deal with question of bank, especially of African bank during the 80s, started to reinstating the equality of the African bank in comparison to any other kind of bank, against the imperial project, against the liberal project, trying to promote diversity within equality. And then they turn to the political sphere only in the last 20 to 30 years. And that's where the corpus of African political thoughts rest on. And in here, you have, broadly speaking, three main branches. One that relates to African socialism, those relates to Ubuntu, and those related to African communitarianism, very largely defined. And those constitute what are the basis of African political thought. While this intertwined with African philosophy is a strength, because it provides a lot of material and a lot of insights that draws both on oral traditions and systematization of its oral tradition, and it reflects the systematization of the work of professional philosophers dealing with this and also reproducing part of local knowledge in local languages and the translation to it into global languages such as English or French. At the same time, it creates a hindrance to the studies and to the independence of political thought itself from African philosophy. It has this huge influence on all the development of African political thought. African communitarianism per se is not, it doesn't yet constitute a fully established political theory. It's only an author that is Mazzolo that recognizes it as a political theory, while most of the authors refer to it as a moral political theory. So they rather refer more to the moral character of the individual and how the moral character of the individual frame the relationship between individual and community, rather than the political aspects per se.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We're going to need to stop the recording in a moment. And before I do that, I wanted to thank you both for the papers and for this interesting discussion. And these are both exciting projects. Thank you for presenting them at this conference.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again for organising.